course, I want to thank Dara, one of our leading investigative journalists, for being here tonight. The way this is going to work is that Ricky's going to say a few words, Kevin's going to say a few words, and then Dara's going to have a Q&A session. When Dara's ready to do that, I'll come up and introduce him. Folks, I'm going to sit down the back now. So thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Yeah, thanks so much. And thank you so much for your hospitality and allowing us to have this event on your premises. It's very, very nice of you. I'm going to keep this short because there's a fair wee bit on here tonight. I'd like to start off by thanking all of you for coming to the book launch tonight. It was very kind of you to do so. I'd particularly like to thank John Crawley and the guys who came up from Derry. And that was lovely to make the journey. Thank you so much. And Garamila Mayoga Bakarja. I'm going to keep this brief because we have a question and answer session with Dara and Kevin. And I'm mentioning Kevin Winters. I want to thank you, Kevin, for your contribution to this book and for your enduring advocacy for those unfortunates who perished in state knife study war and their families. Human rights activism is never easy, but then no one knows that better than you. I knew when Mary impressed Conor Graham's commissioned me to write State Knife Study War that I would be delving into a mucky subterranean world, a domain where murder, treachery and deception was the currency of the day. Central to all the perfidy was Freddie Scappaticci, or Scap as he was known in Republican circles. I started off the book by saying I knew Freddie Scappaticci. Fortunately, I didn't know him well. Looking back, I now wonder if anybody really knew him well. And I've often wondered if, at any time during his career as an agent provocateur and mass murderer for the British state, it crossed his mind to be allowed to up sticks and flee the carnage and heartache that he was creating in his role as the Spy Master General. Demonstrably, as we all know, he has never shown a morsel of regret, even though it is estimated that he was involved in at least 35 murders. And while on the subject of regret, his intelligence services bosses in the tasking and coordinating groups have never expressed any regrets at letting him participate in that mass murder. They keep their heads down and hope that this embarrassment will dissipate into the ether. Equally, while the IRA has apologised to the families in at least 2 cases, they have yet to express any true remorse to the dozens of families whose loved ones they executed and labelled touts, despite the plethora of evidence that now exists showing that those slain were psychologically and physically tortured, and it's outlined in the book. As though all those people done to death in a back alley or a country roadside, and nobody in authority on either side thinks it appropriate to apologise. Shameful, utterly shameful. Apparently, Scap died in April this year. I say apparently because for all we know he could be lying on Bondi Beach guzzling Foster's beer. Officially he's dead, and with his passing it appears any hope of the Canova inquiry securing conviction died also. Not that the British government was taking any chances. The Northern Ireland's Troubled Bill has been running parallel with Canova, and even if John Boucher was of a mind to bring convictions against any party, that bill would circumvent the legal process, which in turn makes the Canova report a £37 million washout. Honest John Boucher was genuine in my view. He deserved a better outcome. Once more, I thank you for coming tonight.
Ricky, thank you for those words. I'm going to ask for permission to sit because I'm not long out of an Achilles heel operation, so standing's a bit difficult. I just want to thank Ricky for asking me to do this evening. I really do feel privileged. There's people here tonight probably far more better positioned to do this than I am, and I was asking myself after Ricky asked me to do this, well, why is he asking me? And I think I'm here probably for one very good reason, and that is that I represented Fred's Capitation, and I ended up as a default solicitor representing people from the Republican movement after the murder of my boss, Pat Finucane, in February '89. Now, Pat was murdered by loyalists in collusion with the state, as is well known, and I found myself thrust on the front line of Castlereagh Holding Centre, Long Cash, and Criminal Road Prison. And that was my world after just leaving law school, basically. And it was an alien world to me. And one of my first cases was this case in 1990, January 1990. I think that's when the Carrigard Avenue was raided. And I arrived into Castlereagh as a completely naive, politically naive, legally naive young solicitor, out of my depth, and dealing with the people arrested in 124 Carrigard Avenue in West Belfast. And one of them was Fred Scappatisha. He was arrested 2 years later, but at the time the people, the householders and other people arrested in connection with the IRA detention of Sandy Lynch. And all of those people went through the criminal process, charges, Crown Court trial and Court of Appeal, and were eventually convicted. But I want to dwell on 124 Carrigard Avenue because in many ways that's where the steak knife story starts. And it's that journey from 124, otherwise nondescript part of West Belfast, right through to Whitehall. And the steak knife story follows that. As well as that, the John Boucher Canova story, the origin of John Boucher's Canova investigation, all stems from 124 Carrigard Avenue. And that's where our story begins. And that was the beginning of my legal story, my legal career. And bizarrely, this case was one of the first ones I ever had. So, the people who were arrested were prosecuted, convicted, and so forth. But Freddie Scappatisha and some others had managed to get offside by the time the cavalry in the shape of E4A had arrived to rescue Sandy Lynch. But Freddie Scappatisha had a problem because a fingerprint of his was recovered on a battery, and that battery was part of a recording device recovered from the house. There was an issue about how he was going to navigate that issue, how he was going to deal with that difficulty, because the Court of Appeal and the original Crown Court, Brian Hutton, I think it was, had said that for anyone else to be prosecuted, arrested, prosecuted and convicted, there needed to be corroborative evidence over and above the evidence or the statement of Sandy Lynch. That was almost prophetic. In some ways, looking back, it was almost signposting a route, if you like, for anyone else who might have been arrested, and that would have included Freddie Scappatisha. So, later in 1982, I can't remember when it was, I remember getting a phone call to say that I had a client arrested, and he was in Castlereagh Holding Centre, and it was Freddie Scappatisha. He was arrested on a building site, and he was taken there after 2 years on the run. I had gone down to see him down south. My office, as it were, in inverted commas, to see him down there was McDonald's in Connolly Street, and I saw him 2 or 3 times there. And in conjunction with the late Oliver Kelly, a statement was arranged, and that statement was taken from one of the householders at 124 by way of explanation, and that explanation was that Freddie Scappatisha was carrying out electrical work at that address, and that was somehow the explanation for his fingerprint on the battery. So, whenever he was arrested, that statement was put into play and left with the police. And for 2 or 3 days, he was interviewed. I saw him throughout that detention, and kept asking what the reaction was to the statement, and there didn't seem to be much reaction. And the question was whether or not that was going to be enough to get him released back out. And he was released, and he was released without charge, no prosecution. That was the end of it. And the naivety in me, the naive solicitor in me at the time, thought this was wonderful. This was down to my fantastic legal strategizing with the late Oliver Kelly, and it was anything but. Really, what I was a sort of a bit part player in a much wider, complex political choreography, political, legal, policing choreography, all designed to facilitate the safe passage of Freddie Scappaticcia out of Castlereagh and back out again. As a sort of a postscript to that, I was talking to John Ware not so long ago. John Ware, the journalist who did the Scappaticcia documentary in 2017, and he said to me, Kevin, you know, don't take this the wrong way, but it suited the intelligence authorities to have you as a young, naive greenhorn of a solicitor from outside Banbridge in County Down who really hadn't a clue. That fitted perfectly and allowed that wider agenda to carry through. So I didn't take any offence of that. No offence, John. But I suppose the balloon was now up on Fred Scappaticcia. At some stage between the hit on 124 Carrigard Avenue and 1994, he was stood down in the IRA. I know there's a bit of debate about that, and Ricky goes into that in his book. It looks like it was probably stood down before 1992, although there was some speculation that it would have gone on after that. I know that Peter Keeley, another agent, said in his book that he was interrogated by Scappaticcia in 1994 in North Belfast, but most people would say that that's just nonsense. And whether or not that was part of a wider psyops to somehow put Freddie Scappaticcia as involved in all sorts of other things after 92, I don't know. But it looks like he was gone by 1982. The story on Scappaticcia possibly could have fizzled out after that. Certainly after his removal, and between that time, post-Good Friday Agreement, we then moved to a stage where the likes of Liam Clark, Greg Harkin, through journalistic endeavours, start raising the issue of steak knife and the senior IRA figure who was operating as a British Army agent. And then all of that culminates in 2003 in the now infamous meeting, press conference, call it what you will, on the Falls Road in Michael Flanagan's office, when Freddie Scappaticcia denies that he is the agent in steak knife. The story might have finished there, except it was reprised again the following year with the Cook Report and the documentary in the Cook Report. And I think it related to the interview given in '93 with Cook outside the Culloden. So it really kept alive and upped the ante on Scappaticcia as a high-end, highly placed agent inside the IRA. So that looked, as the years went by after that, one could have been forgiven for thinking, well, that's maybe the end of that. You know, Scappaticcia is out, he's gone, and that's that. And it's a bit like in a film, you're coming near towards the end of the film and you think you've got the denouement, but in fact there's another twist. And the other twist for me was the Canova story and the legal journey in that. So it's revisited again, and the steak knife issue comes to the fore. And again, all roads lead back to 124 Carrigard Avenue. So if you had, if you like, the investigative journalistic outing of Freddie Scappaticcia, then compounded by the legal odyssey to out him further, if that's the right way to put it. In preparing for this evening, I kept thinking, well, how many people know exactly the origin of the Canova investigation by John Boucher? And to my mind, in open source readings, you don't really see an awful lot of detail on exactly how this began. And I just want to dwell on that. And the story does begin at 124, and the applications then made by Danny Morrison and others who filed applications to the CCRC, the Criminal Cases Review Commission, to challenge the convictions, quite simply because there was real suspicion about who the tout was that gave away the whole operation. And what happened then was that those applications were filed in court, and in 2009 the Court of Appeal quashed the convictions for everybody that was in that house, and that included even the likes of Jimmy Martin, the householder, who pleaded guilty. He'd actually made statements saying that he was involved in it. Those convictions were all overturned, but there was a very, very significant throwaway comment which is almost lost in translation. The Court of Appeal at the very end of acquitting everybody said, and I quote, "And we recommend there be an investigation to see whether or not there were any breaches of the laws of Northern Ireland." Now, that was an almost throwaway, withering remark by the Court of Appeal. The judges had obviously seen some material or papers following the CCRC referral of the case back to the Court of Appeal. And it was prophetic, because it's this comment, throwaway comment by the court, served, if you like, as the DNA origin for what was to become Operation Canova. So for 2 or 3 years after that, I'd actually forgotten about it, because everybody was very happy to get their convictions quashed and to go ahead and put their compensation claims in. And but for 2 or 3 years, I wrote to all the different agencies, including the PSNI, the Police Ombudsman's Office, and the PPS. And there was a kind of a pass the parcel game evolved. One agency saying, no, you're supposed to deal with it, and we don't know what we're dealing with. It's not for us to deal with, it's for you to deal with. For 2 years, endless correspondence back and forward, and eventually the Chief Constable said, this is a matter for the Police Ombudsman. So the Police Ombudsman at that time was Al Hutchinson, and I remember sitting at a human rights conference to deal with the legacy of the past. This is 2011, and we were talking about delays in the system. And someone from the audience asked Al Hutchinson, "How long is it going to take you to deal with all the historic complaint investigations, including all these cases, including the issue arising out of 124 Carrigart Avenue?" And he very smugly said, "It's going to take me 50 years at current resourcing levels." And I remember thinking, right, that's going to be the end of this investigation. It's going to go nowhere. So we wrote to him and said, "You need to investigate this." He says, "Sorry, I don't have the resources." So we went to court. Jimmy Martin, the householder of 124, was the applicant in a test case that was taken to the High Court, and the case came before the court, and we said, "You need to investigate this." The explanation put forward by the Ombudsman was, "We don't have the money, we don't have the resources." Same old, same argument, still today, 2023. And what happened then was that the judge, Seamus Tracy, said, "You have a statutory obligation to investigate, go and get the money." And Paul Holmes, the Director of Historic Investigations, filed an affidavit setting out the details about how the money was going to come in to allow the Ombudsman to investigate this. And the funding process in place, we then moved forward. But not before the CJI, a Criminal Justice Inspector report, said that the Ombudsman's Office wasn't fit for purpose. It had been compromised on its independence, and so on. And Al Hutchinson resigned. Exit stage left Al Hutchinson. Enter stage right Dr. Michael Maguire, who was very much fit for purpose for this investigation. And he said he would look at it and deal with it. And thereafter, a number of families came forward who had lost loved ones killed by the IRA Internal Security Unit, including allegations about our subject matter tonight, Freddie Scappatissi. And it reached a point of critical mass in 2015, and up to 40 cases Dr. Michael Maguire had on his books at that stage, and he referred the file then over to Barr McGrory, the director of the PPS. Barr McGrory looked at it and said, "This needs investigated." And we lobbied the DPP to say, "Please progress this and take it forward." And he referred by way of what's called a Section 35(5) referral, and sent the files, all the files, to George Hamilton, the then Chief Constable. We then lobbied George Hamilton to say, "You can't investigate this. It has to be an independent police officer or an outside agency." And after so many months of wrangling on that, enter John Boucher, Operation Canova, and his 50, 60, 70 million pound operation, 60, 70 odd detectives. And for the last 6 years, the Canova team has been investigating the incidents at 124, which all culminated then in all the other cases linked to Freddie Scappatissi. So, what we had here was, I felt I was a sort of a bit part player in that wider legal choreography, but that's the origin of John Boucher. in many ways it was a default investigation that was never meant to be. This was an unloved child of an investigation. It wasn't supposed to be. There wasn't any political agitation. You certainly didn't find any protesters out in the street with placards saying there must be justice and truth recovery for the families of the victims of alleged touts and informants of internal security of the IRA. And it morphed then, and I suppose really this was an example of, if you like, engaging with the agencies of the justice system, British justice system, if you like, delivering on the injustices of a British intelligence policing system. And that's essentially what we had. But the problem was that it was a case where a lot of these families, up until this point, had felt bereft of any sort of support that would come along to help them in this, because as we know only too well, the stigma of the tout runs very, very deep in Irish history, and that stigma extended to the next generation. So these were people without a voice, completely voiceless, and this investigation comes out of the ether, out of nowhere, and all of a sudden the steak knife story, if you like, the Freddie Scappatisha story, has a new life, and off it goes again, and has been the subject of an investigation for the last 6 years. So I suppose my question tonight then is, in light of all of that, and in light of the pending Kenova investigation, is Ricky's book slightly cart before the horse? Should it be tonight? Should this book launch be tonight, or should it have been after Kenova? And I would say absolutely not. This is the perfect timing in many ways for this book launch tonight. He's got his timing completely right. In going to publication now, he's definitely set the tone. The timing is everything in life, and I think the timing in this couldn't be better. I think, Ricky, what you've done is you've thrown down the gauntlet to the challenging issues that you raise in your book. You put down actually a drawbridge for John Boucher to come over with his team of detectives and all his resources, and to deliver on all of the serious political and legal issues that you've raised in your book, some of which were highlighted today and in the media. Your book is a real tour de force of the many terrible case histories cited in it. You have been able to access a lot of Republican sources, which lends additional credibility to the driving narrative on what are really terribly, terribly sensitive accounts. And it's a difficult read at times in some of the detail. There's so many issues in the book, and I can't dwell on it all tonight, but I just want to pick out some. You know, there's the issue about the timing of the arrest of Fred Scappatisha. There's all of that. Why did E4A, Frew, et al. Decide to make a move on at that stage? Is that all about trying to undermine the work of John Stevens, who had arrived to investigate Brian Nelson at that time? Was it all about taking the spotlight away from Nelson and the role of the state in overseeing loyalist state collusion in the killing of so many people in the late 80s up until that point? There's the issue about prosecutions. Are we going to have prosecutions? The key issue about when was Freddie Scappatisha recruited, who recruited him and when, why exactly was he turned? I mean, it's an ongoing evolving issue. The traditional areas, and we've seen them all cited in the past, about how a person is turned, in inverted commas, to work for a state. Envy, jealousy, revenge, crisis of conscience, or, as is increasingly the driving narrative here, sexual indiscretion. And again, that has been highlighted, I think, today in one of the newspapers. But for me, the most challenging and pivotal part of this book relates to the contention that PIRA Internal Security Unit from about 1986, 1987 had access to internal decision making on all or some of Northern Command IRA operations. If that's correct, and Ricky makes a cogent case for that given his source material, if that is correct, then the speculation on Freddie Scappatisha, on what General Wilsey said in his infamous interview as being the golden egg within the IRA, then that holds up to scrutiny. If that's not correct, then it isn't necessarily he isn't necessarily the person who's been made out to be over the years. If he did have access to high level intelligence on all or many PIRA operations for a 3 or 4 year period in the late 1980s, then it does lead to the extraordinary but logical conclusion that in many ways British military intelligence, or as you have posited, the TCGs, the task controlling groups, controlled which IRA operations were allowed to go ahead and which ones were compromised. Now, it's a bit like, I remember seeing the film, I'm sure many of you saw it a number of years ago, The Imitation Game. And I remember watching that film thinking, and there was a scene in it, it's about Alan Turing, who cracked the Enigma code with the British intelligence personnel were trying to tap into the Germans' intelligence. And in this particular occasion, you had the British fleet in the North Sea, and they were able to work out that the Germans' U-boats were about to attack them. And there's that iconic scene in the film where someone says, get the phone call through to the ships to let them know, set it off. And Alan Turing character stops that phone call being made, and all hell breaks loose. You know, why am I not being allowed to warn off my brother on the British boat? And he was told no. So that man was allowed to die in order to preserve that wider intelligence agenda. So I pose the question here, was Pirate ISU in the late 1980s a modification of that very same mantra? Did people have to die in order to maintain that agenda? Was this a macabre, if you like, Troubles version of The Imitation Game? And taking a quote from your book, Ricky, inflicting maximum damage without alerting them to the fact they'd been fatally compromised. Your quote in the book, which aptly summarises that whole issue. So, we had an unwanted child of an investigation in Canova, but at some point the Canova investigation, on reflection of this, it morphs into something completely different from that default unwanted investigation. And I think at a certain way along the journey of the last 6 years, it almost became politically convenient to pivot Freddie Scappatisha at the apex, if you like, of all things state-Republican collusion. So if that's right, whose agenda did that suit? Was General Willsey, for example, part of some sort of wider PSYOPs operation to just converge everything onto Fred Scappatisha to the exclusion of all else, on all other possible high-ranking agents within the Republican movement? Were we all being funneled or corralled into thinking that Freddie Scappatisha was the only high-end spy inside the IRA? So, and these are issues that your book helped bring to the surface, Ricky. I think to answer that, the starting point are the somewhat narrow terms of reference of Canova. This was not an investigation into the entirety of Pirate ISU. Canova isn't that. It's into the investigation of one member of Pirate ISU, Freddie Scappatisha. Yes, it touches upon other cases and other individuals loosely linked to it and other persons, but we don't get to find out if any of the other ISU members, whether dead or alive, were also agents of TCG, be it British Military Intelligence and so forth. We are going to get a decision on Freddie Scappatisha, however, in this report. I know there's an awful lot of conjecture about the report, the Canova report, what it's going to say, how far it's going to go, but I think we can be certain of one thing: it will out Freddie Scappatisha and his status within ISU and what exactly that relationship or role was within the wider British Military Intelligence agenda. I suppose another dividend, if you like, of looking at a Freddie Scappatisha-centric approach is that this is really about one agent in the IRA killing other IRA agents or suspect informants. The Canova investigation is not an investigation into IRA agent killing members of the security forces, and that's an important distinction. In my view, there will never be such an investigation. And that's why there's no similar investigation into the likes of Peter Keeley, who was involved in different ways in killing members of the security forces. That's actually a bridge too far. And it's almost like, well, if it's IRA killing IRA, in some ways that's an easier political sell to perhaps unionists and so forth. And I know these are challenging issues that are brought out on a read of Ricky's book. Ricky also raises the issue as to whether or not Freddie Scappatisha was part of a project or he was a sole individual within Pirate ISU. In my drawer at home, I have there's a box with steak knives in it. There's half a dozen steak knives in it. There isn't one steak knife. My personal view is that Freddie Scappatisha was one of a number of steak knives. That might be slightly jarring I'm not trying to contradict what, but the point is this, is that I don't think he operated alone. I don't think any of these sort of issues can be seen in silos all by themselves. You have to look at things in a wider context. So I don't think he operated alone, and I think an awful lot of this too is designed, as I said earlier, without repeating myself, is to fixate in some way that he is the be all and end all of everything Republican state collusion. I don't agree with that, and I don't buy into that, and that's a deeply personal view. Ricky, your book is an excellent addition to the cohort of books that have existed to date and will no doubt populate this ever-evolving, controversial, politically and legally controversial theme. It's a brave book because it just deals with awkward political issues, as highlighted today on the radio bulletin. It also raises the notion, that the more we find out, in fact, the less we know. After the publication of Canova, and as the cases are dealt with, I think there's going to be an awful lot more politically uncomfortable of a journey in relation to Britain's true intelligence-led role in potentially what their role was on one view of the de-escalation of the armed struggle and the upscaling of a political agenda in the Republican movement. To my mind, the Scappatisha story can't be looked at in isolation, but it has to be looked at in that wider macro level, if that makes any sense. It's long been open season on the extent and role of loyalist state collusion, and we've seen and read the reports in relation to De Silva, Corrie, Stevens and countless police ombudsman's investigations, but there's never been an equivalent in terms of Republican state collusion until now. As I've said earlier, John Boucher's report will make findings on the state's intelligence role on the oversight of Freddie Scappatisha in killing other IRA members, but it doesn't look at agents killing members of the security forces. In my view, that's never going to happen, and it can't happen now after Lord Kane's legacy bill has been passed into law. That's why we're having a legacy bill, to stop any future repetition of a Canova-esque investigation into other IRA agents. So, I want to say a couple of remarks just about the Canova investigation as to why not. In fact, it is the prototype for the legacy bill, because in many quarters, John Boucher's approach to this has been commended as a roadmap to deal with all things legacy. We're hoping that the legacy of his investigation, when it's published, I think next month, is that it's not just going to be seen as completely Freddie Scappatisha centric, and it is increasingly likely, and I said this on the radio this morning, I don't think there's going to be any prosecutions of people, whether ex-IRA or handlers or anybody in the security forces. I think that bridge has, I think that it's gone, that ship has passed, because first of all, Freddie Scappatisha is dead. The moment to prosecute was at least 2 years ago, and it should have happened. We've been waiting for 3-4 years now for direction to prosecute, and it's gone. I think families are going to end up having to take and complete their civil cases in terms of access to justice, and that's regrettable. But I want to finish on one final note, and I think it's important to remember this. A final thought for the people murdered by this state-sponsored murder programme. They form the subject matter for Ricky's compelling book, and for the families. I think there's always a danger in highlighting it, when you're highlighting and exploring complex legal and political issues, that we end up somehow talking about victims in the abstract, and they can sort of get lost in translation, and I think it's important not to forget that. Now, Canova won't tell us about whether or not there's any other agents working in the state, within the state at that time, but there's enough there to say that the state was involved in the oversight and execution of its own citizens. And just because some of the deceased might have been informants or alleged touts, that ought not to diminish the heinous nature of what went on here at this time in the conflict. They shouldn't be downsized in some way. The legacy of the Freddie Scappatisha story points, in my view, to the state killing its own citizens in order to promote and protect its own intelligence agenda, whether that be at the highest TCG level, as Ricky says, or at some lower level. If all of these people died in order to facilitate the state having control over IRA operations to whatever degree, then that can never be condoned. The deceased here should be remembered just like any other victims of the conflict, and their families should be praised and supported just like any other victims' families and campaign groups. We do well to remember that. We always need to guard against the hierarchy, the deficiencies of the hierarchy of victimhood. I think, Ricky, your book has helped give those families a much needed voice, and for that you're to be commended. Well done, and thank you again for asking me to do this today.